Today in the Daily Dose, natural disasters. The Minoan Eruption of Thera. The precise date of the Minoan eruption has been fiercely debated for decades by archaeologists and geologists, and while most academics place the event around 1600 BCE, the Minoan eruption at Thera is thought to be in a magnitude of 7 on the Richter scale, which decimated the Minoan settlements of Akrotira, as well as communities in agricultural areas on nearby islands and the northern coast of Crete. Thought to be 4 times the strength of the well-documented eruption at Krakatoa, the Minoan eruption at present-day Santorini is widely believed to be one of the largest volcanic events in human history. Although there are no clear records of the eruption, its plume may have been described in the Egyptian tempest Stel, while the ensuing volcanic winter coincides with a cold snap described in the Chinese bamboo annals. Adding to the historic significance of the eruption, geologist Barbara J. Sivertson has further sought to establish a link between the Minoan eruption and the biblical exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Geological evidence shows that the Thera volcano erupted numerous times over several 100,000 years before the catastrophic Minoan eruption of 1600 BCE. In a recurring process, the volcano would erupt violently before collapsing into a roughly circular, seawater-filled caldera, with numerous small islands forming in a circle around the primary vent. The caldera would slowly refill with magma, building up a new dome until the next eruption started the cycle over again. When the main volcanic eruption finally occurred, it hurled ash and magma 20 miles high into the stratosphere, at the same time creating a tsunami with an estimated wave height of 115 to 492 feet, which decimated the northern coastline of Crete. The dramatic western coastline of Santorini was created when the island split in two during the primary blast. Greek folklore has perpetuated the story that the Minoans living on Thera departed the island in a flotilla of ocean-going vessels when the frequency of earthquakes began to intensify, making their way to nearby Crete before celebrating their salvation by the time the main eruption finally occurred. Sadly, however, none of the celebrants possessed knowledge of the association of earthquakes and tsunamis, and when the wave crashed ashore on the northern coast of Crete, all the survivors were drowned in a watery death before their bodies were washed out to sea. Sudden death at Pompeii. 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire was shaken to its core by one of the worst natural disasters to strike the ancient world. In less than 48 hours, the thriving city of Pompeii, along with some 5,000 of her residents, were wiped from the face of the earth when Mount Vesuvius erupted after 1,500 years of dormancy. Today, amid the crumbling walls and faded paintings of Pompeii, archaeologists have unearthed tantalizing clues about the city's final moments before disaster buried this once thriving city. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, many of Pompeii's residents remained ignorant about their coming demise, as some 13 to 20 feet of volcanic ash and pumice buried them alive, suffocating thousands as they huddled in fetal postures against the onslaught of raining ash. While the loss of life was tragic and widespread, the now excavated city offers a unique snapshot into ancient Roman life, frozen in time when the city was literally buried alive. After extensive excavation, archaeologists have unearthed what was clearly a wealthy city, which enjoyed many fine public buildings and luxurious private homes, replete with lavish decorations, furnishings, and works of art. While much of the art disappeared during early tomb raider excavations, archaeologists have made plaster casts of Pompeii's many victims, preserving their dying postures while revealing the cataclysmic conditions that struck them down during their final moments on Earth. Numerous graffiti carvings provide a wealth of examples of the largely lost vulgar Latin spoken colloquially at the time, contrasting with the formal language of the classical writers. During the 2-day eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the first 18 hours saw a steady onslaught of pumice rain, which allowed most of the city's residents to escape the coming disaster. For those who decided to stay, however, volcanic ash and pyroclastic flows incinerated or suffocated the remaining population, entombing many of them with their finest jewelry and cherished possessions scattered on or about their bodies. By evening of the second day, the eruption was over, leaving behind a sun-choked haze that would float over southern Italy for days. During the last 800,000 years of Earth history, the planet has witnessed no less than 11 glacial and interglacial periods, with glacial defined as a global drop in average temperatures with snow from pole to pole, while interglacial is a period of glacial melting and a warming climate. Known as the Little Ice Age, the last glacial event lasted from 1303 to 1850, dropping global temperatures by as much as 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, while disrupting social, economic, and intellectual progress throughout the world. Reaching its peak in 1570, yet persisting for another century, theories abound regarding its causal origins, ranging from decreased sunspot activity to a spike in active volcanoes, which in turn imposed changes in oceanic currents that altered pressures on continental plates. Others point to a precipitous decline in North American indigenous populations during the Age of Exploration, felled by foreign diseases, which, according to Quaternary Science Reviews, killed an estimated 56 million people, leading to a period of dramatic reforestation and a drastic reduction in atmospheric CO2 levels. No matter its causal links, lower temperatures impacted societal orders everywhere on Earth, including the collapse of the Ming Dynasty in 1644 China, which failed in part by waves of famine brought about by failing harvests. In Europe, rivers, lakes, and harbors froze solid, leading to frost fairs on the Thames River, when fairgrounds and merchants spread across London's tideway. Men, women, and animals died of hypothermia, while in 1588, the Spanish Armada was lost to an Arctic hurricane. After the wet and cold winter of 1665, vegetation flourished before turning into tinder-dry accelerant in the rainless summer of 1666, contributing to the Great Fire of London that same year. Food shortages led to panics, uprisings, and food riots, along with a spike in witch trials during a time before science, when peasants and nobles alike blamed witches for failing harvests. Persisting well into the mid-19th century, the Little Ice Age had a profound impact on trade, feudal societies, and global exploration, with one notable exception. Trees took longer to mature in the cold climate, resulting in denser wood that produced the exceptional sound qualities of violins made by luthiers such as Stradivarius and Guarneri, making the Little Ice Age a time of intense adaptation for humans everywhere. The Irish Potato Famine. Known as the Great Hunger, or An Gorta Mór in the Gaelic, more than 100 years before the onset of famine, landed gentry introduced a variety of potato, nicknamed the Irish lumper, into the island nation, which soon became a staple for the poor, especially during the barren months of winter. When potato crops began to fail in 1845, caused by the infectious transmission of a fungal-like microorganism known as Phytophthora infestans, Irish leaders in Dublin petitioned Queen Victoria and British Parliament to intervene. But when Britain failed to act in any meaningful way, thousands of Irish poor began to die from starvation, while hundreds of thousands more died from diseases caused by malnutrition. Concentrated mainly in the west and south of Ireland, with little aid from her British overlords, from 1845 to 1852, more than 1 million Irish died from andrahail, or the worst hard times, causing the mass exodus of over 2 million people who fled Ireland aboard packet ships, steamboats, and barks, establishing the Irish potato famine as the greatest mass migration from any single island in recorded human history. The migration of disaffected Irish also impacted the level of widespread unrest experienced during the European revolutions of 1848, and has since been blamed by historians on absentee landlords, British inaction, and a dependence by the Irish people on a single crop. During the famine's peak year in 1847, known as Black 47, roughly 1 million people died, while an additional 1 million fled the country, kicking off a century-long population drain in Ireland of nearly 25% of her pre-famine population. After the end of the Great Hunger, relations between the Irish and their British rulers remained strained, igniting ethnic and sectarian tensions for decades to come, while boosting a sense of nationalism in Ireland, as well as Irish immigrant populations abroad. According to English documentary filmmaker John Percival, the famine, in his words, became part of the long story of betrayal and exploitation which led to the growing movement in Ireland for independence. To further worsen the reputation of an uncaring British authority, records indicate that while more than 1 million Irish perished from starvation, large food exports of peas, beans, rabbits, fish, and honey, bound primarily to Great Britain, increased during the worst years of the famine, making the Irish potato famine a tragic heartbreak for the Irish people, as well as a permanent stain on the history of British rule. The Great California Flood of 1862. A pounding rain took up on Christmas Eve of 1861, continuing unabated for the next 43 days of terror, panic, and death, transforming rivers running down from the Sierra Nevada mountains into raging spillways that swept away entire communities and mining settlements. Overflowing rivers poured water into the state's low-lying San Joaquin Valley, turning it into an inland sea 300 miles long, 20 miles wide, and 30 feet deep, drowning hundreds of thousands of cattle, while the human death toll, although never accurately accounted for, most likely rose into the thousands. Downtown Sacramento submerged under 10 feet of brackish water, forcing the state legislature to move to San Francisco until the city dried out, destroying 25% of all California real estate. By the time the storm was over, the state of California was bankrupt. While the Central Valley took the brunt of the storm, much of the remaining west coast of America suffered egregious flooding and loss of property and life, only to worsen in the spring when melting mountain snowpack brought on a second round of torrential flooding. Marysville, Santa Rosa, Auburn, parts of Sonora, Nevada City, and Napa were all underwater, while smaller towns like Empire City and Mokelumne City were simply erased from the face of the earth. Even in Los Angeles, the LA, San Gabriel, and Santa Ana rivers all flooded and merged, creating an inland sea 18 miles wide. Further inland in Riverside, the Santa Ana River completely washed away the small town of Aguamanza near present-day Colton. In the Mojave Desert, Owens Valley was also devastated by floods, causing great misery among the Paiute people, since the game animals they relied upon for food had drowned and washed away. The storm also paused the Civil War effort in the Pacific Coast Theater, which had been heating up in the months leading up to the protracted storm. Now that the Central Valley is home to 6 million Californians, on land producing crops worth $20 billion annually, meteorologists and climatologists have studied sediment deposits in widespread locations, which indicate the region has received similar storms every 2 centuries, going back at least over the past 2,000 years. Caused by atmospheric rivers that build over the Pacific Ocean, generally 1,000 miles in length and 250 miles wide, in a predictive model known as ArcStorm, which was updated and revised in 2022. Scientists believe a repeat of the storm of 1862 is well overdue. Modeling a relentless yet shorter storm lasting 23 days, such an event would cause $400 billion in property and agricultural losses, not to mention mass evacuations from low-lying areas, making the Great California Flood of 1862 a long-forgotten nightmare during the early history of the Golden State. The Peshtigo Fire of 1871. Largely forgotten by historians, journalists, and average Americans, due to another fire that occurred on the same day, which made headline news in papers across the nation. On the night of October 8, 1871, a series of small Midwestern fires exploded by the same high winds and tinder-dry conditions that took the lives of 300 people, destroyed 17,000 structures, and displaced more than 100,000 people in Chicago. In the months and years leading up to the Midwestern Fire of 1871, Peshtigo, Wisconsin had grown in population to some 1,800 largely European immigrants who came to the region due to a logging boom fueled by the lumber-hungry city of Chicago, some 250 nautical miles south along the western banks of Lake Michigan. As Chicago burned, so did much of Wisconsin and Michigan, when small isolated fires exploded into uncontrollable firestorms which soon engulfed the town of Peshtigo. Surrounded by dense forests in every direction but the Peshtigo River, mothers snatched panicked children from their beds, while men formed ad hoc fire brigades in a futile attempt to beat back the fire. The blaze started as a low rumbling noise, like the distant approach of a train, survivors later recalled, as a cyclone-like firestorm rapidly felled the town, along with a staggering 1.2 million acres of densely forested land. Those who made it into the river in time watched in horror as their town disappeared before their eyes, while many of the lucky survivors died of hypothermia before it was safe to come out of the water. Those who made it to sunrise found a bleak, desolate prairie, the very location of the streets almost a matter of doubt, wrote one newspaper reporter. No vestige of human habitation remained, and the steaming, freezing, wretched group, crazed by their unutterable terror and despair, could but vaguely recognize one another in the murky light of day. Eventually blamed on drought conditions and shoddy forest management practices, between 500 to 800 Peshtigo residents perished in the blaze, while as many as 2,400 died in the region that night, along with countless livestock and farm animals. While the fire has been mostly lost to American memory, the same can't be said for the residents of modern-day Peshtigo, who still honor the dead with a well-tended mass grave of over 300 of the town's early residents, many too charred to be identified as a man or a woman, making the Peshtigo Fire of 1871 one of the deadliest fires in American history. The Mann Gulch Fire of 1949. In the early 1940s, the U.S. Forest Service created an elite team of smoke jumpers who parachuted into remote wildfires, which turned sadly tragic on August 5, 1949, when on a broiling hot day 20 miles from Helena, Montana, a fire was reported in Mann Gulch. In response, 15 smoke jumpers, most between the ages of 17 and 23, flew 120 miles from Missoula to attack the fire from the ground. Landing safely at 4:10 p.m., they hiked down into Mann Gulch with their heavy packs and Pulaski axes strapped to their backs, splitting into smaller units for the attack on the reported grass fire. Their plan was to fight the fire with the Missouri River and a tributary creek to their backs, which would also second as their escape route. But when they forded the creek, they found themselves trapped by a wall of flames 30 feet high. The fire had a tailwind of 30 to 40 miles an hour, and since their only escape route was up and over a 76% mountain grade, they found themselves heavily burdened with their equipment, as well as trapped by rapidly advancing flames, moving at 7 miles an hour. 10 young smoke jumpers would perish shortly before 6 p.m., while 5 made it over the top of the ridge by abandoning their heavy packs and axes. 2 survivors would later pass away from their burns, while 33-year-old foreman Wag Dodge would create a brush fire tactic, now known as an escape fire. Nearing 6 p.m., with the fire just minutes from burning him alive, Dodge lit a backfire up the hill he needed to climb, and as his backfire burned the grass in his intended escape route, he walked into it, covered his face with a wet towel, and laid down face first on the ground. Dodge heard and felt the main fire passing by on either side of him, but he survived the ordeal miraculously unscathed. Until that moment, there had been no history of a firefighter having done such a maneuver, but escape fires are now considered an accepted strategy in the fight against grass fires. Dodge's survival so captivated the writer Norman Maclean, author of A River Runs Through It, that he wrote a second book about the Mann Gulch Fire entitled Young Men and Fire, making the Mann Gulch Fire a tragic yet pioneering event in firefighting history. The Crescent City Tsunami of 1964. On Good Friday, 1964, at exactly 5:36 p.m., the largest earthquake ever recorded in North America, a whopping 9.2 magnitude on the Richter scale, decimated Anchorage, Alaska, collapsing buildings while taking 131 innocent lives. Lasting 4 minutes and 38 seconds, the megathrust earthquake unleashed a series of 5 tsunami waves, each one more powerful than the last, reaching open ocean wave heights of 150 feet before slamming into the coastlines of Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, and the United States. Hardest hit was the small logging and fishing community of Crescent City, California, just south of the Oregon border, when in the late night hours of March 27th, 4 to 5 tsunami waves swept through 60 blocks of the town of some 3,000 residents, completely destroying 29 blocks in the harbor area, while taking the lives of 12 people and injuring 24 others. In an area prone to tsunamis as far back as the 1700s, after the first wave swept through town, father and son tavern owners Gary and Bill Clausen returned to the Long Branch with Gary's wife, Bill's fiancée, and 2 employees, mopping up the floor before celebrating Bill's birthday with one last drink of the night. Their decision would prove fatal when the second wave ripped the Long Branch off its foundation. Escaping to their now floating roof, they boarded a runaway boat in hopes of reaching safety. Instead, the boat capsized in raging waters, taking the lives of everyone but 27-year-old Bill Clausen. When the fourth wave came ashore under the light of a full moon, Battery Point lighthouse keepers Peggy Coons and her husband Roxy watched in horror as the ocean receded more than 3/4 of a mile offshore, exposing a labyrinth of once underwater caves, canyons, and basins, taking with it the Citizen's dock and a large lumber barge, before a frightening wall of water passed their lighthouse fortification and swept into town. Peggy recalls that as the water flushed back out to sea, cars and buildings were now moving seaward again. Beds, furniture, televisions, mattresses, and other objects were moving by so fast that we could barely tell what they were, making the Crescent City Tsunami of 1964 one of the most devastating events in California's long history of natural catastrophes. the Mount St. Helens Eruption. In the spring of 1980, Mount St. Helens stood as one of the most majestic peaks in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. In a region rich in natural beauty and an abundance of wildlife, the Mount St. Helens volcano started to rumble back to life after 120 years of dormancy. For weeks, the ground shook almost daily, leaving geologists stymied over what would happen next. The answer came on May 18th, when a 5.1 magnitude earthquake rocked the mountain with a disconcerting punch. Within 10 seconds, the volcano's north face collapsed in the largest landslide in recorded history. Millions of tons of magma burst into the sky, followed by a pyroclastic flow of searing gas and rock, flattening forests as it swept down the mountain. 4 miles beneath the erupting summit, Spirit Lake was overtaken by debris, lifting its waterline by more than 200 feet. The eruption spewed toxic gases miles into the air. The northern slope of the mountain became buried in several feet of ash, snuffing out nearly all life in its path. 57 people died in the eruption, including loggers, scientists, campers, and one unlucky reporter. Some of the dead were found upwards of 13 miles away from the volcano, in areas previously considered safe from a major eruption. The drifting ash continued throughout the day, disrupting air traffic for hundreds of miles in every direction of what became known as the blowdown zone. On the ground, trees and wildlife were incinerated by hot ash and rock in a 200 square mile radius around the volcano, turning a once verdant landscape into charred, moon-like desolation. More than 100 species of birds were eradicated from the region, along with deer and elk, black bears, wolverines, cougars, and bobcats. 40 years later, the region has experienced a gradual return to life, while the mountain itself has seen nearly 1,300 feet of her summit permanently removed. The once majestic mountain peak now sports a gaping crater a mile wide and 2,000 feet deep, making Mount St. Helens Eruption the largest and most destructive volcanic catastrophe in North America in well over a century. The San Francisco earthquake of 1989. On the 17th of October, 1989, Game 3 of the World Series, of what would become known as the Battle of the Bay, was about to go down in one of the greatest freeway series in baseball history. With the Oakland A's leading 2-0, Al Michaels and Tim McCarver reported live from Candlestick Park as the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland Athletics were just minutes away from game time. Instead, at 5:04 p.m., with live cameras rolling on the field, a whopping 6.9 magnitude earthquake rocked the Bay Area with devastating consequences. Epicentered near Loma Prieta Peak in the Santa Cruz Mountains, 60 miles south of San Francisco, 67 people would lose their lives over the next 15 seconds, injuring more than 3,000 others in one of the largest quakes in Bay Area history. Built on reclaimed marshland for the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition, San Francisco's Marina District suffered some of the worst damage in the city. Known as liquefaction, the loosely packed and waterlogged soil shifted beneath buildings, sparking structural failures and ruptured gas line fires in homes built after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that destroyed nearly 500 city blocks. Scheduled for an earthquake retrofit later the next week, one person was killed when a single span of the upper deck collapsed on the Bay Bridge, but the worst damage was reserved for a 1.25-mile segment of the Cypress Street Viaduct along Interstate 880, which pancaked onto the lower deck, taking the lives of 42 victims in a grisly moment of engineering catastrophe. One of the worst hard-hit areas was the agricultural community of Watsonville, just miles from the quake's epicenter, where more than 1 in 8 homes were destroyed at the same time leveling 30% of Watsonville's downtown district and forcing hundreds of jittery residents into massive tent cities during the 20 aftershocks that followed over the next 7 days. Of the estimated $5 billion in damages, more than $11 billion in today's currency, after the dust settled on the big quake, San Francisco and other communities enacted strict retrofitting laws on all unreinforced masonry buildings in the quake-prone region, making the Loma Prieta earthquake a massive game-changer in the history of San Francisco. The Boxing Day Tsunami of 2004. On the day after Christmas, 2004, at 7:59 in the morning, one of the largest earthquakes in recorded history, a whopping 9.1 on the Richter scale, ripped through an undersea fault in the Indian Ocean, propelling a massive surge of water toward the coastlines of 18 countries. The 2004 quake ruptured a 900-mile stretch of fault line along the Indian and Australian plates, 31 miles below the ocean surface. Rather than delivering one violent jolt, the quake lasted for an unrelenting 10 minutes, releasing as much pent-up energy as several thousand nuclear bomb detonations. The city of Banda Aceh, on the northern tip of Sumatra, was closest to the earthquake's epicenter, delivering a 100-foot wall of water through the town less than 20 minutes after the quake, engulfing the coastal city of 320,000 people, while instantly taking the lives of a third of her population. Buildings splintered like flimsy twigs, while trees, cars, humans, and debris were swept inland before washing back out to sea. Thailand was next on the target list, with a tsunami wave traveling at 500 miles an hour across the Indian Ocean, bulldozing through Phang Nga and Phuket with merciless devastation and loss of life. 2.5 hours after the earthquake triggered outwardly expanding tsunami waves, on the opposite side of the Indian Ocean, a wall of water hit the southeastern coast of India near the city of Chennai, pushing debris-choked water miles inland and killing more than 10,000 mostly women and children, since many of the men were out fishing for the day. Sri Lanka as well witnessed horrific devastation, sweeping 30,000 people out to sea, while leaving hundreds of thousands in a state of homelessness. The Boxing Day Tsunami would prove to be the deadliest in recorded history, taking a staggering 230,000 lives in a matter of hours, while destroying $15 billion in coastal businesses and homes. In early 2005, the UN agreed to develop an international tsunami warning system, including regional systems in the Indian Ocean, Northeast Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and Caribbean. The Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System was developed between 2006 and 2013, bringing renewed hope and safety to so many coastal regions devastated by such a catastrophic event. Hurricane Katrina. When Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast in the early morning hours of August 29, 2005, the Category 3 storm brought sustained winds of 100 to 140 miles an hour, stretching some 400 miles wide as it bore through Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, causing more than $100 billion in damages, while displacing some 1 million people from the Gulf Coast region. And while New Orleans had already been flooded by 5 prior hurricanes in the 20th century, residents who lacked any means of transportation for Mayor Ray Nagin's first ever mandatory evacuation order found themselves trapped in high water once the city's levee systems suffered catastrophic failures. Of the city's 500,000 residents, an astounding 112,000 found themselves trapped in the Superdome or in their rapidly flooding homes. By 9 a.m. that same morning, after Katrina had moved inland toward her eventual decline, residents in low-lying places such as St. Bernard Parish and the 9th Ward scrambled into attics and onto rooftops as floodwaters rose, many drowning in attics when they lacked the necessary tools to cut through their roofs. While many people acted heroically in the storm's aftermath, the Coast Guard rescued some 34,000 people, while the all-volunteer Cajun Navy rescued untold more. The response by state, local, and federal officials proved to be a study in failed disaster management. Known as FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency took multiple days to establish any form of operations in the city, while President George W. Bush and other federal officials seemed completely unaware of the human toll caused by Katrina's wrath. While Katrina misplaced many Gulf Coast residents for years to come, the storm and her aftermath took the lives of nearly 2,000 people while laying down a path of destruction that affected 90,000 square miles of the nation's Gulf Coast region. And while President Bush initially commended FEMA Director Michael D. Brown, a rising flood of criticism eventually forced his resignation. Other blundering officials met similar fates, including Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco, who declined to seek re-election in 2007, while Mayor Nagin resigned in 2010 before being convicted in 2014 on charges of bribery, fraud, and money laundering while in office, making Hurricane Katrina a needlessly painful debacle in the annals of government oversight.